Good morning and welcome to the wide world of cyber geography. Um, for those of you that have not read the notes that I've posted on Google Classroom, here's what's going to happen today in this video. We are going to start a review of the lessons that we had on Sub-Saharan Africa physical geography just prior to taking the break for the long weekend. It's my goal between today and tomorrow to get through this review, and hopefully when you visited the school you not only picked up the hard copies that I left of the work, but that you also grabbed your textbook and your notebook. If you did not grab your textbook and your notebook, I have uploaded the slides onto the Google Classroom site, so you are able to at least get through the slideshow that we had in class. If you did not pick up the hard copy lessons from the school, I've also uploaded those worksheets to Google Classroom, and those should be available to you today to download and complete so that we can close out the block on Sub-Saharan Africa by Tuesday, and you will have an online quiz followed by us starting the block of instruction on the south central portion of Asia, specifically the Indian subcontinent. So in any case, we will take a few minutes today to walk through some of these slides and review the information on them. We will finish that review in tomorrow's video and move on from there. So right off the bat, we did talk about the regions of Africa. There are 5 of them. North Africa was our last block of instruction. As you can see here on the map, North Africa encompasses most of the Sahara Desert and the Mediterranean coast. Sub-Saharan Africa actually starts in the bottom half of the Sahara Desert. The Sahara Desert actually extends down to about here, as you can see with my mouse pointer. But they tend to draw the line, the regional lines, based on the national boundaries. So even though some of these northernmost countries have land that extends into the Sahara, they are still counted as Sub-Saharan Africa for the purpose of physical geography. So West Africa, noted here in the pink. Most of the countries in West Africa border the Sahara. So if you see the 4 large countries here in the northern part of West Africa, they all border the Sahara. In fact, most of them lie primarily inside the Sahara. But then some of these smaller countries here in what's called the armpit of Africa also have boundaries that touch up against the southern edge of the Sahara. And if you remember from our block of instruction on northern Africa, the Sahara Desert is actually growing. It is extending southward at the rate of 1 to 1.5 feet per year. And so eventually, of course, the Sahara will be down into much more of Sudan, this large country in East Africa, but also down into more of these countries in the armpit. East Africa, over here in the violet color, also known as the Horn of Africa. You may remember from class that we defined the Horn as these countries here: Somalia, Ethiopia, Eritrea, and Djibouti, specifically as the rhinoceros horn there. But most geographers will continue to refer to the entire East Africa region as being part of the Horn of Africa. Central Africa, which is the smallest region, is noted here in the tan color and does have a small border with the Atlantic Ocean. But for the most part, Central Africa is simply made up of the countries that didn't fit any of the other regions of Africa. And Central Africa is largely jungle to the north and Serengeti to the south and east here. And last but not least, Southern Africa. Now, we did talk about in class where Southern Africa, the region, is different from South Africa, this country on the very southern tip. And we talked about that quite extensively because it came up pretty much every time we were talking about any of the physical features in the region. But Southern Africa, it's important to note, also includes the country of Madagascar, this island off the coast of Africa. Some people will classify Madagascar as its own region, but geographers will include it as part of Southern Africa. To step back a bit, one of the things that we didn't mention here with East Africa is the Seychelles Islands located out here in the Indian Ocean. Even though they are their own country, are also part of the East Africa or Horn of Africa. Now, we talked extensively on the first day of class about the islands around Africa. And this slide is talking about the island countries. These are islands that are sovereign nations in their own right. They do not belong to another country on the mainland of Africa. And Madagascar, which we just talked about as being part of Southern Africa, is of course the largest island off the coast of Africa, and it is the fourth largest island in the world as far as just physical size goes. Most people are familiar with Madagascar because of the animated movies. And actually, if you've seen those movies, while talking animals are not realistic at all, the fact remains that a lot of the wildlife that they discuss in those movies is actually factual. It's actually based in Madagascar. Mauritius, or Mauritius, depending on how you pronounce it, that's off the coast of Madagascar here. And you can see that it's on the tail end of a fairly significant underwater mountain range. This ridge right here is largely underwater. There is some small islands up here between the Seychelles and Madagascar that are actually part of a mainland African country. Most of that mountain range stays underwater, but Mauritius is the four major islands where that mountain range actually comes up above the surface of the Indian Ocean here on the southern tip. The Seychelles, located here in the blue circle, they are considered to be part of the Horn of Africa, and there are over 100 small islands that make up the Seychelles. A lot of these islands are simply the very top of some underwater mountain, barely appear as a large rock sticking up out of the water. Some of them have some very sparse plant growth on them, but largely uninhabitable, largely unable to accommodate people simply because there is no natural port. There is no way to get from a boat onto a lot of these small islands because they're simply tall rocks sticking up out of the water. However, there are a significant number of islands that are habitable, that do have natural seaports, do have the capability to support life. Some of them even have freshwater springs that come up from underground. And the Seychelles are a very hot tourist attraction. The snorkeling and the scuba diving around the Seychelles Islands are reportedly some of the most beautiful diving locations in the entire world. Comoros, right here between the northern edge of Madagascar and the east coast of Africa, located in the brown. Comoros is 3 small islands, also a very big tourist industry there for much the same reason. They do have some beautiful underwater reefs in that area. Um, not quite as pricey as the Seychelles Islands, but still very nice. Over on the Atlantic side, we have Cape Verde. That actually translates to Green Islands. Cape Verde is 10 small islands just off the coast of North Africa here in the Atlantic Ocean. And the most significant thing we talked about in class with regards to Cape Verde was the fact that there is a space tracking station located there that actually feeds information to NASA on the location of satellites and spacecraft orbiting the Earth. Very good fishing off the coast of Cape Verde. The last one we talked about is in the black circle here in the armpit of Africa, the island country of Sao Tome and Principe. That translates to St. Thomas and the Prince. It is 3 small islands located just off the Ivory Coast here in the armpit of Africa. And they also have quite a bit of a tourist industry there. They also have a significant fishing industry. It's actually one of the most common areas. This entire coast here off the west part of southern Africa is actually very common grounds for people who want to go shark hunting. We did talk about other major islands off the coast of Africa that are not countries in their own right. And while we did not necessarily highlight them here on the map, we did mention the countries that they belong to. So off the east coast of Africa here, you have Zanzibar, off the coast of Tanzania, right down in this area. You have Lamu off the coast of Kenya in this area. Most of the colonial islands are off the Atlantic coast. So when you look at the Canary Islands out here, they are actually part of Spain, even though they're considered part of the African continent. You have Mayotte and Réunion in this area here, which are part of France. St. Helena, and Ascension, and Tristan da Cunha, also off the Atlantic coast here in this area, that all belong to the country of Britain. Of all of these, probably the most famous, Zanzibar over here is well known for being a spice island. It's the source of things like cinnamon and vanilla, among other rather pricey spices. And it also has some mineral reserves. Tanzanite, which is unique to this part of Africa, appears in great supply off the island of Zanzibar. It was widely used in medieval literature all the way up through probably the early 19th century as being an exotic locale where rich potentates would retire and pirates would, of course, ply their trade. The Canary Islands up here, belonging to Spain, also have a space tracking station that also feeds information to NASA. As a matter of fact, the Canary Islands tracking station was used quite extensively during our space shuttle program when we were regularly launching space shuttles The Canary Islands were the primary tracking station for those. And then Réunion Island off of France at one time housed a French prison that was used for political prisoners. It also housed a garrison of the French Foreign Legion. Now it's very much a tourist industry island off the coast of West Africa here. We then spent a day talking about plateaus and lowlands. And when we talked about the plateaus, we talked about the fact that Sub-Saharan Africa is in fact one large plateau. We talked about the fact that it starts over here on the west coast and it stair steps up to the highest point in Central Africa, and then has a rather steep 1 or 2 step drop off towards the Indian Ocean. So it's almost as if you have one very wide plateau that covers the entire area, a smaller plateau atop that one, and then an even smaller plateau atop that. It's very stair-stepped going up across the continent. So most of the higher areas are here in the central regions of Sub-Saharan Africa, whereas out along the coasts is where you have most of your drop-offs. We talked about the plateau elevations starting at around 1,000 feet above mean sea level out near the coast and ranging up to 7,000 feet or more along this area here, the highlands associated with the Great Rift Valley. So again, very broad stair steps going across most of Eastern and Central Africa, and then very sharp 1 or 2 step down into Eastern Africa where it meets the Indian Ocean. We did talk about the fact that even though there are higher mountain ranges pretty much everywhere else in the world, you've got the Alps, the Himalayas, the Andes, the Rockies, etc., that are all much taller mountains, and in general much taller mountain ranges. That overall, the average elevation of any region in the world is lower than the average elevation of Sub-Saharan Africa. So even though we're looking at elevations that even their volcanic mountains here top out at, as you can see, less than 20,000 feet. They only have 3 or 4 significantly tall peaks. Mount Kilimanjaro, Mount Kenya being the 2 tallest here. The fact that their plateaus top out at 7,000 feet throughout this whole area of Africa makes the entire Sub-Saharan region, on average, the highest elevation in the world. Continuing with our discussion of plateaus and lowlands, we talked about the definition of a basin. We talked about how these large basins, annotated here on the map in tan, are scattered all over the African plateau. There's not a single geographic basin that is less than 625 miles across. Some of these basins are as much as 5,000 feet deep. And the basins are created a number of different ways. The most common is, of course, as we talked about in class, weathering and erosion. The high points of the plateau get weathered down, and that weathered rock gets carried away by the rivers that flow from the basins out over the plateaus towards the oceans. The most common one that we talked about was here in the Congo Basin, where you can see multiple rivers feeding into the main Congo River that floods out into the Atlantic Ocean there. So especially in this region here where the elevations top out at about 7,000 feet, those basins can be as much as 5,000 feet deep. But when you take 5,000 feet deep, which is less than a mile deep, and you stretch it out over 625 miles of distance across, the basin itself appears to be just extremely shallow, because obviously less than a mile deep spread out over 600 miles is about 1/1000 ratio of depth to breadth, and consequently there's not a lot of water collection in those deeper basins. The Congo Basin, which we talked about just a minute ago, does collect a significant amount of water, but because it's also in an area of Africa which gets extensive rainfall, most of that water is going to immediately flood off into the Congo River. The Congo Basin is the single largest lowland area in the African interior. We did touch a little bit on the Kalahari Basin, which is incredibly arid. In fact, the western part of the Kalahari Basin here is referred to as the Kalahari Desert because it is extremely dry. And the Sudan Basin also extending up into the Sahara, also an extremely dry lowland, although the Nile does flow through it over here on the eastern side. The Chad Basin, we are going to talk about Lake Chad on another slide as part of the review, but this area also extremely arid as the Sahara advances down across it. The Chouf Basin here has the Niger River flowing through it, and as such drains fairly significantly down into the armpit area of the Atlantic Ocean. So while it does extend up into the Sahara in the northern part of the basin, the southern part is actually quite damp. We talked specifically about the plateaus and lowlands, the edges of which define the stair stepping. And the most significant one that we talked about was the Great Escarpment, represented here on the map with this brown line. Most of the Great Escarpment occurs in the country of South Africa. It does extend up a little bit into Namibia here in the west, and it does extend up into a couple of different countries here on the east coast, Mozambique and Zimbabwe. But the Great Escarpment is probably the steepest and most jagged of all the escarpments in Africa. If you go back to this previous slide, there is escarpment along these areas in the Horn. There is escarpment along these Atlantic coastal areas. They're just not very steep. When you look at the Great Escarpment, as you can see on this profile view, the drop off in the Great Escarpment is absolutely huge. That drop off is as much as 2,500 to 3,000 feet as it cascades down to the coastal areas. We talked about a couple of different things with regard to that. The first one that we talked about was, of course, the effect on the flow of water off of the plateau in this area to the edge of the escarpment, the number of waterfalls that are actually created by these rivers draining off of the plateaus, and where some of the, not necessarily the highest waterfalls in the world, but some of the largest as far as the volume of water that is flowing over the edge of the escarpments at any given point in time. We also talked about the significant barriers to trade and how these escarpments are actually one of the reasons, one of the primary reasons, that the central portions of Africa were so rarely explored by any outside countries. Um, the fact is that it's actually very difficult to get into the interior regions of Africa because of these sharp drop-offs. The rivers, you can go up a river a very short way before you come up against this very steep waterfall. And the idea of porting a boat, removing it from the water and literally carrying it up the hill to put it back in the water above the waterfall, um, that the steep terrain made porting boats actually very, very difficult. And only the very smallest of boats could actually get ported up over the escarpments and allow people to proceed upriver. We also talked about the fact that until uh, massive construction equipment was available, that it was almost impossible to put roads or railroads through the escarpment areas, again, because that incredibly steep drop-off would require a lot of either switchbacks or stair stepping of both highways and railroads. And so the only way to really get into this interior region was either to come through the lowland areas that have the most gradual step up to the top of the plateaus, or to physically walk in, to climb the escarpment and walk in, which was a huge barrier to any sort of large party, any army, any large exploration party or whatnot, to get into the inner regions of Africa. And this contributed not only to limits on migrations of people across Africa, but limits to trade, limits to colonization, and by association, limits to the economic and industrial development of Central Africa. So the landforms themselves are seen as one of the major causes of Africa, Central Africa in particular, being so much less developed than a lot of the rest of the world. We talked about mountains. Specifically, we talked about the two highest mountains in Africa. Both of them occur in the volcanic region of the Rift Valley. If you don't remember the significance of the Rift Valley, you can actually go back and look at the videos that I have embedded behind some of these photographs. But the Rift Valley being that break that is actually separating Africa from one large continent into two smaller continents. Because that rift goes all the way down through the crust, the volcanic activity is very, very prevalent there. And so we see a lot of volcanic mountains show up. The two highest, Mount Kilimanjaro, the highest mountain in Africa, rises up over the Serengeti Plains and is in the area that borders Kenya and Tanzania. It is so tall at over 19,000 feet that year-round, even though it's in a tropical region, it has this snow cap on it. You can also see very steep sides on the mountain that make it very, very difficult to climb. There are a number of people that climb Mount Kilimanjaro every year, and your typical climbing party will actually take 3 to 4 days to get to the top. The last length of it being well above the 13,000 foot mark, which is where climbers actually require supplemental oxygen in order to continue moving. It is that snow cap that gave it its name. Kilimanjaro in the local language means shining mountain, and it's because the sunlight reflecting off of that snow cap gives the top of the mountain a sort of silvery appearance that makes it shine, and it can be seen from miles around. Mount Kenya, second largest mountain in Africa, also a volcano, at just over 17,000 feet MSL. It will have a snow cap on it as well, but it is not necessarily year-round. There are several weeks in the heart of the summer where most of the snow will actually melt off of Mount Kenya. But also a common point for people who like easier mountain climbs. Um, Also very steep-sided, requiring a couple of days at least to get to the top uh, once reaching the base camp at uh, the top of that flatter part of the mountains. We talked about Africa's only real mountain range, the Drakensberg Range. Drakensberg, of course, translated from the German or Dutch, since it's in South Africa. The Dutch language is actually very prevalent in southern Africa. Drakensberg literally means dragon's mountain. And one of the reasons why it was given this name is because the mountains themselves are actually made up of very spiky looking um, uh, growths of mountain. So the mountain range itself was created when the uh, the two plates moved against each other, pushing the ground up into a rather spiky area. But then, because of weathering and erosion, a lot of the softer rock was carried away, leaving the spires behind, the harder rock spires. So it had the appearance of being like dragon teeth or dragon claws. The local area, in the local parlance, the eastern side of the range is actually referred to as the barrier of pointed spears. And part of the reason is because that row of spires that's left behind actually looks like large spears had been thrust into the ground, resembling a picket line of sorts. And because they're very difficult to climb, because even the low spots between the spears are higher up than the prevailing terrain, and it's very, very difficult to climb up to those passes and get through them. It's near impossible for any sort of vehicles, any sort of large armies or anybody carrying a lot of equipment to get through that mountain range with any kind of reliability. We did see the video behind this picture. We did see as the Drakensberg Range having several areas. By the way, if we look at the map here, this is the Drakensberg Range here. Being a very popular tourist attraction. There are a lot of hikers that will actually come through, and they will hike various trails that have been marked out by the governments in southern Africa, including, if you recall, a couple of points between the spires where cables are strung across the gap between peaks, where ladders are actually mounted to the side of some of these spires to enable people who are not professional mountain climbers to be able to explore the Drakensberg Range. The last thing we're going to talk about in today's video is the Great Rift Valley. When we pick up tomorrow, we will pick up with the remainder of the slideshow. But with the Great Rift Valley, as I just stated earlier, this is a large crack in the Earth's crust going all the way down into the mantle. in some places thousands of feet deep. And this crack in the crust has a significant amount of volcanic activity, particularly in this region right here in the southern part of the Horn of Africa. In fact, this is where Mount Kenya and Mount Kilimanjaro um, volcanoes both reside in this section here. But what's happening is the crust is actually breaking apart, and this entire section of Africa on the eastern coast is actually breaking apart from the main continent of Africa. And at some point in the distant future, and we're talking um, a million years or more into the future, Africa is literally going to break apart along this crack and become two brand new continents. And when that happens, the area that is currently the Great Rift Valley is going to flood, because as the break occurs up here in the north and down here in the south, ocean water from the Indian Ocean is going to flood into that low level, and it's going to create an inland sea in much of this part of Eastern Africa. Um, Scientists, even now, are tentatively naming the new continent Nubia, after what used to be called the Nubian region of Eastern Africa, and they are referring to the sea that has not yet been created as the Nubian Sea. Obviously, a million years from now, we won't be around to know if they were correct. But this whole area along the eastern coast of Africa will be underwater, and the bulk of this part of the continent will be a separate continent out here in the Indian Ocean. There are videos that are embedded behind both of these photos. So if you want to refresh your memory on a lot of the detail of the Great Rift Valley, feel free to pull up the slideshow that is in the classroom portion, Google Classroom, and you can click on those videos to refresh your memory. So tomorrow we will pick up with the remainder of the review on landforms and waterways throughout the Sub-Saharan African region. We will be looking at some more material that I will upload into Google Classroom. For those of you that failed to take your textbooks home with you, there are some select portions of the textbook that I will try to get scanned and uploaded so that you can at least read them online. At the very least, expect on Wednesday to be taking a quote-unquote take-home test here in Google Classroom on Sub-Saharan Africa physical geography. And on Thursday, we will actually start on the material for the Indian subcontinent, Southern Asia, which I believe is chapter 26 in your textbook. Let me double check that. I'm sorry, chapter 22, Physical Geography of South Africa. Sorry, South Asia, which will start in your textbooks on page 596 with the readings starting on page 606. So we will start on that block of instruction on Thursday. If you have any questions or comments in the meantime, you should feel free to go ahead and type them into the feed section of Google Classroom. Understand that if you type a question or a comment, the entire class is able to read it. Don't be embarrassed if you think it's a silly question. If you have that question, it's likely that most of your classmates do as well. So if you want to ask the question, your classmates will all see my response to it, and it's actually helpful to everybody. So feel free to communicate through Google Classroom. You can also email me directly at my school email address, cmiller@greenville, and I will respond as quickly as possible. With that, I hope you have a great day, and we will see you again tomorrow.